Mr. Bociurkiw, thanks a lot for your time and for speaking to CNN News 18 again. You are in Tel Aviv. You've been tracking very closely the developments over the last 1 month, post the horrifying October 7 attacks on Israel and the subsequent ground offensive. Where do you think Israel stands as we speak, both in terms of internally, their perception of what's happening, and externally of how this is being received?
Right. Well, thanks for having me. Well, first of all, clearly there's no off-ramp to this conflict. In fact, Mr. Netanyahu, the prime minister, said yesterday, I think to the shock of many Israelis and also foreign partners, that Israel will have security kind of responsibility for Gaza indefinitely. That's a word a lot of people don't like because, again, there's no off-ramp to it. Of course, on the top of everyone's minds on this side are the 200 plus hostages that are still in the Gaza Strip. A lot of concern because of the relentless Israeli bombing that their lives could be endangered. Hamas has said that some have been killed by strikes, but their statements, of course, are very difficult to verify or even believe. The other thing happening here is as we speak, Israeli troops for the first time in a long, long time are in the Gaza Strip in huge numbers in the northern part, trying to secure that. They seem to be having quite a bit of ground success, and of course they're backed up by the air campaign. But also, once they're finished with the job, they're flushing out Hamas, the question will be who will run Gaza, who will govern it. The idea has been floated here that the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank right now, could come in and do that. I've talked to others, Palestinians. They don't think the PA are capable. There's a lot of allegations of corruption, and also their popularity is very low in the West Bank from doing a very poor job. And the other thing we have to say is they're definitely not going to come into Gaza, figuratively speaking, on the back end of Israeli tanks. So, some people I've spoken to said, well, maybe the only solution then will be some internationally monitored settlement where some kind of administrators come in and do the job. It's very, very difficult to see that far. One last thing that has to be said, I mean, it is a time of war, but one of the big differences I see between here and Ukraine is in Ukraine, almost 2 years on, the support for President Zelensky is very, very strong. He's really proven himself as a wartime leader, whereas here, almost from the get-go, a lot of people are pointing the finger at Prime Minister Netanyahu for what happened. They accuse him and his circle of taking their eye off the ball, of not being vigilant enough, and of arrogance. So every day that goes by, there's, again, fear for those hostages, and there's a lot of pressure on him to, as you see all over the place here, to bring them home. So I don't think his political life will be that much longer.
What do you make of the difference emerging very openly and publicly between what the US believes should happen in a post-war Gaza versus what the Israeli Prime Minister has hinted at? We are being told that behind closed doors, American emissaries are insisting that not only should there be some sort of a timed ceasefire, because some of the support that Israel had is shrinking very quickly or evaporating quickly, to borrow some phrases. What do you make of where America stands versus where Israel is today?
Sure. Well, let's make one thing clear. America is in the driver's seat here in terms of the huge financial support. Also, when President Biden came here, and I believe Secretary of State Tony Blinken, they both sat in on the war cabinet. That is really unprecedented here. So that's very interesting. Excuse me. So there's a lot of daylight right now between the two positions. You're right. The U.S. administration is calling for humanitarian pause, or whatever the phrase they're using, whereas Netanyahu is saying, no way, that will only give Hamas a chance to regroup, to rebuild. So, but I think at the end of the day, the U.S. pressure will win, and they'll have to stop. And, the most important thing right now is for aid to get in, for the wounded to get out. There are a lot of wounded, especially women and children. So last night, the ICRC, which is usually very quiet behind the scenes, came out and said, it complained that one of their convoys was fired upon. They didn't say by whom, but they said that these are conditions that no humanitarian agency can operate. The numbers are horrific, north of 10,000 right now. A good portion of those are children. We haven't seen numbers like this in a long time. In fact, the numbers of civilian deaths actually exceeds the number of civilians who were killed in the first 2 to 3 years of the Ukrainian war, from 2014 to onwards. So something needs to be done immediately in that regard, because I think Israel, if it doesn't show more flexibility, that it could lose more support, not only here, but also internationally. There are already a number of states who have cut off relations or pulled their diplomats and ambassadors. And look, at the end of the day, if you're a country, you need as many friends as you can, no matter what the circumstances.
Just speaking on the numbers, there is a lot of concern also that some of the numbers coming in, from example, from Gaza, as you said earlier, that it's difficult to ascertain what is reality and what is not. Could some of these numbers be inflated? How do we assess what is the right number coming in from Gaza?
It's impossible to say. What we can say is that we're dealing with a enclosed enclave, which before the war started had about 2.1 million people. Like many places in the Middle East, almost half of the population are youth. So their exposure to the violence is absolutely huge. We know that these are basically urban areas. People don't have the luxury of leaving or of fleeing because the borders are closed. So it does make a lot of sense that if you do these types of strikes, that the civilian casualties will be huge. Having said that, Hamas, these are terrorist squads. These are basically animals who have no regard for civilian life whatsoever. And it does appear more and more that they're using the hostages, that they're using Gazan civilians as human shields, that they hide their weaponry, their tunnels under hospitals, close to schools. And, again, it's hard to verify the videos, but some of the videos out of Gaza showed civilians who had either been injured or lost loved ones blaming Hamas for this. So there's no question that they need to be removed. And the sooner that happens, the better. And all of us are hoping that there can be a quick return to normalcy, but it will take a long time. It will take billions of dollars. And one last point here is a legitimate fear, is that in this bombing campaign, yes, you may be flushing out, getting rid of the Hamas terrorists, but how many more extremists are you creating? I mean, imagine being a young person, you've lost everybody in your family, you saw how this would happen. How are you going to grow up, and what kind of feelings?
Absolutely. There is a question of whether this just perpetuates the cycle as far as this conflict is concerned. And
Right.
that's what such conflicts tend to do. My final question, Michael, while there is a daylight between the American and the Israeli position right now, one thing the Americans seem to be very consistent with and steadfast behind Israel is that Hamas needs to be eliminated completely. Do you think that goal can be realized? Is it a realistic goal? And how soon? As you said, it could take a while, but how soon do you think
Sure.
both American and Israeli intelligence believe that they can do this?
Yeah, sure. Well, one more thing that if I could add to illustrate my last point about this kind of violence perpetuating extremism is if I could take you back to about 2004 when I was working here for UNICEF. We were in the southern part of the Gaza Strip near Rafah, which everyone knows by now that name. And we met a teenager who was at a school who was doing exactly what she's supposed to be doing, going to school, learning, cleaning house, listening to her parents. And when we interviewed her on camera, she was behind this kind of Mickey Mouse motif. The thing is, that motif was all shot up by consistent Israeli attacks and gunfire and that sort of thing. So we look at her and we look at that, and we asked her, what would you like to do when you grow up? And she goes, I'd like to get even. So I think we all know what she meant by that. But that was even during the quieter times. So imagine now. In terms of the end goal here, flushing out Hamas, I mean, it's one of the most difficult urban fighting environments you can imagine. If I can compare it, well, not compare it to, but remind you of the example in Ukraine of the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol, it took 80 days of relentless Russian bombing to reach a point where the Ukrainian civilians and soldiers, which were basically huddling together, came out and surrendered. So that goes to show you how difficult these things can be. The other thing is of concern, of course, is that civilians from the targeted northern area either haven't left, are being prevented from leaving, or have nowhere to go. So that complicates things as well. So I think everyone here agrees, because we're now 1 month into this, that it will take a long, long time. No one knows when. And that's also a similarity, by the way, with the Ukraine war. We're both at that situation where we don't know how long this takes. And, you know, I have to tell you, just staying a few days here on the Israeli side, I think it's also beginning to affect people psychologically and understandably, because people can't go on with their normal lives. I mean, if you go around this neighborhood where I am, normally it's bustling. Absolutely bustling with tourists and local residents. Many places are closed, or they don't have the staff to stay open because either their staff have been drafted or mobilized, or they volunteered, or as some in this area have told me, they were injured or killed in that attack on the festival. So the ripple effects are huge. It's basically paralyzed the place. So, you know, like in Ukraine, like anywhere in the world where these conflicts tend to drag on, the sooner they end, the better, because that can start a process of return to normalcy and a process of rebuilding.
Could I ask you about, Hamas? There's been a lot of call for ceasefire. There's been a lot of calls for humanitarian pause. Some have even come out and outrightly defended Hamas actions as those of
Mm-hmm.
an oppressed people. But there is barely, even amongst that group, who doesn't find them to be pure terrorist actions. There is very little call for Hamas to release the hostages, which actually can be the most important thing that can bring a pause to this incessant war. Why is there, even from the Palestinian Authority, for example, barely a squeak? They've been conspicuous from, in their absence in this entire scenario over the last 1 month. Barely have we heard from them. Why is there no pressure on Hamas to release these hostages, which can actually de escalate very quickly the
Right.
situation?
Yeah, you're right. There has been conspicuously little coming from Ramallah, from the Palestinian Authority. I think most of their credibility was gone. You know, the leader, Mr. Abbas, has very, very low popularity rating. So I don't think that, you know, whatever they say can be taken with credibility. But look, if I can again draw the comparison with Ukraine. For example, in 2014, when I was with the OSCE there in Ukraine on the ground, and the Russian terrorists, we can call them that, shot down Malaysia Airlines M1817, killing all 298 people on board. The only way our team got there within the first 24 hours was because Moscow told their Russian-backed thugs in Donetsk to let us in. Similarly here with Hamas, I think the only people who can have leverage on them are the people who are their backers, namely Iran. So when that happens, you may see some sort of movement. I'm not going to even call it a humanitarian action because they don't have the capability to even think that way or feel that way. But it could take external pressure for that to happen. And again, I have to say the big fear here, and it aches you when you walk around these neighborhoods here in Tel Aviv. Everywhere you look, there are posters, there are signs, hashtag bring them home. And the longer this drags on, the more the bombing campaign goes on, the bigger the fears are that they won't return home. We also have to remind people that these are not just Israelis, they're people from all over the world. They're babies, they're grandmothers, they're physically challenged people. why hold them and why not let them go first? Because they're of no use to these terrorists. But that's the situation we find ourselves in at the moment.
Absolutely. Michael, I do appreciate your time. Thanks a lot for speaking to us and just giving us your insight on not just the global politics on this in this case, but also what you have seen and heard and felt in Tel Aviv. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.